Now, Vietnam lays claim to the entire Paracel Island group under its extended exclusive economic zone. Its foreign ministry responded to a journalist's question about China's island building like this. Vietnam has ample historical evidence and legal grounds to affirm our sovereignty over the Paracel Islands, including Antelope Reef, in accordance with international law. Any foreign activities conducted there without Vietnam's permission are completely illegal and invalid. Ronan, so this statement was actually only in response to a journalist's question at the press conference. It wasn't, a proactive statement that was issued. It wasn't a diplomatic démarche. How unhappy do you think Vietnam is about this development?
I think they are absolutely unhappy, but when you compare, what they actually say and deliver, what we can actually summarize is strong words, weak delivery. But when you think about it, you see that Vietnam is really facing a difficult or impossible situation, right? So like the Paracels are a claim that no government in Hanoi can actually just, abandon at home. But, China actually took, the islands in 1947. And now has basically just built a paramilitary wall around the Croissant group, blocking Vietnamese access. And right now, Vietnam basically has, they have no way to actually reverse, what is happening on the ground. So basically what you can see is that, they protest for the sovereignty record, but what is also happening is that they try to actually engage Beijing. Hanoi is trying to engage in Beijing, behind closed doors, because they also noticed that this is not the right moment to actually just confront China, basically without the tension coming from the U.S. And also when you consider the power asymmetry between these two countries, Hanoi really needs to play smart.
Right. And on that point, Bryce, so can we expect that this will push Vietnam to basically deepen security ties with the U.S. because it needs to have that counterbalance against China?
Yes, I think that could be a potential outcome. I think it's also important to remember too that Vietnam has a very different approach to this versus the Philippines, and for a while, Vietnam not being so vocal as the Filipinos have been about building up in the South China Sea has given them what they view as a lot more strategic leeway because they've been able to balance that relationship with Beijing in a way that they feel is a little bit more constructive, whereas the Philippines has really kind of felt like it's on the outside in within ASEAN. And I think you're going to see a lot of that reflected in the different ways they're going to talk about the South China Sea, given their current ASEAN chairman position right now.
Right, and yet, we can argue about which approach the Philippines or Vietnam's is the best, and yet what we can see here is just China just very publicly, a very fast development, as we all think is going to become the biggest base of China's in the South China Sea, and effectively, as Ronan said, hemming in Vietnam. I mean, how, in practical terms, will it be impacted, Bryce?
I think in Vietnam, it could be impacted in many different ways, right? So the practical considerations when it comes to like resources in the South China Sea are the biggest one. So related to fishing rights, related to potential future sort of like, deep sea bed sort of like mining rights.
And oil exploration too.
Exactly. Oil exploration as well. Obviously the biggest sort of thing. It really does impact Hanoi in a way that I don't think Hanoi has had to confront in a while. And part of that too, and this is not to say that the Filipino way is better than the Vietnamese way or vice versa. As I mentioned or alluded to earlier, Vietnam has been able to sort of skate by and not have to take a lot of that flack. And that could be a potential future outcome of this, is a lot more attention being put towards Vietnam from Beijing versus the Filipinos and what they've been up to in defending their own rights in the region as well.
So Ronan, we saw with, we refer to them as the big three. That's Mischief Reef, Subi Reef, and also Fiery Cross Reef. They're all in the Spratlys in the southern part of the South China Sea, and now Antelope Reef. Do you think that this represents a shift where China will seek to create more bases that are closer because of that resupply that you mentioned? Perhaps we're looking at sort of phase 2 of China's military bases. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you can certainly describe, what's going on, as a trend or even as the clear shift. So basically, Antelope being like only 300 kilometers away, basically right now, China basically reinforced its control over South China Sea, like in ours. Right now the supply chain, basically is secured once they get a firm control over Antelope. And I also think that they are not giving up, on Scarborough. But the situation there is a lot trickier, precisely because the Filipino approach you just mentioned. It's right, sits right in their EEZ, and they're there to actually confront, with or without the American help. They're there to confront the giant. They're there to be vocal. So basically, and in terms of Paracels, you don't see virtually military push-up from anyone. So that's the reason why China builds big there first. So yes, I think there's a shift, and we perhaps are going to expect more.
Okay.
China is going to do more on this.
Okay. And Bryce, we haven't mentioned yet China's nuclear submarine base, which is the Sanya one, on Hainan. What does that mean in terms of the location of Antelope Reef being so close?
Yeah, so I think the Sanya base on Hainan is incredibly important, and I would argue is one of the most important naval hubs, even if you're not considering bases that are faced more directly towards Taiwan. I think it does a few different things, right? So it allows for a lot more operational area for submarine bases, or submarines rather, to operate. And also would allow for the ability to do more surveillance, potentially logistics, and just general sort of coverage across the North China Sea, which would impact many different sort of contingencies related to something purely in the South China Sea for a clash over Filipino islands, to Taiwan itself, to clashes with other sort of closer neighbors like Vietnam. So I think the proximity to Sanya is very, very prominent to be noted with this particular buildup.
Ronan, so the Philippines has the presidency of ASEAN. It actually itself has complied with the DOC because it is a rules-based culture. As a president of ASEAN, what can it actually do about this? This is a clear violation. Yeah, although it's in Vietnam's rather than the Philippines' EEZ. What can they do about this to counter it?
Yeah, and it is, I think it is worth mentioning, as for starters, that Manila actually followed DOC. So they did not break the law. They didn't build. And it was China built at massive scale. So now they are thus able to occupy the moral high ground. They didn't violate anything.
Yeah.
China is the one that should be condemned. Okay, so as in chair, I think Manila wants to basically make something happen, abiding code of conduct by year's end. Because previously, you can consider the previous DOC as something that without clear enforcement. So basically, people just sign the DOC. They say they will follow DOC, and even if they fail to be abided by DOC, there's no punishment or there's no enforcement that can make sure that the status quo won't be shifted in any country's favor simply because they use brutal force. So this is actually what China has been doing in the past decades to rewrite the status quo. So I think as ASEAN chair, what really needs to be done is a clear binding code of conduct so that Beijing will not hand its loudest critics a win. So basically, this is what I think ASEAN countries should do. They should use Antelope to draw a line. They should put a hard limits on new construction. So this is definitely a red flag that you should never try to get across. So basically, unlike Vietnam basically they has a edge because there's some construction going on. Philippines is different. They occupy, the moral high ground, so they can be the leader to say, this is what we want. And as, as ASEAN countries, everybody will be on the same page. It's what we want China to sign, and all the neighboring countries will be abided by that.
Okay, so Bryce, but how strong is that moral position when you do have Vietnam, reclamation, island building to huge levels, not as high as China, but a lot? And also, how much does it complicate the fact that we know that Manila has asked China for oil during this Iran war?
Yeah, it complicates a lot. And the table, the moral high ground, just a little bit. I mean, I think what you might get out of the Filipinos is, I'm a little bit skeptical that the Filipinos will be able to get ASEAN on board. I mean, there's been a lot of divergence across ASEAN given the Filipinos sort of approach, as we were alluding to earlier. I do think that they might be able to get a little bit more stringent language around code of conduct. But also, I think they might be able to encourage more things like documentation, continued coalition building, right? So Filipinos have really looked towards external actors from ASEAN to bolster them in lieu of not having ASEAN support, generally speaking, right? And also just broader sort of capacity building. But that's going to be very hard to balance, like you mentioned, given sort of oil shortages that you're getting, the desire to want to find alternatives to the Middle East, specifically in the South China Sea. And if the Filipinos feel that that might be the best path forward, which we'll find out in the coming weeks and months here in this region, given that every country really here in the Indo-Pacific is having a lot of issues around obtaining oil, that could be like a really big issue for the Filipinos going forward. And that might mean that they have to need to step back a little bit in terms of some of the things that they've been doing in the last few years of being more hawkish and more vocal about defending their own sort of like sovereignty and territory in West Philippine Sea / South China Sea.